In this game, Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa teaches us a very effective way to play against the Sicilian. It's a fairly simple system that has a lot of poison in it. His opponent is Grandmaster Visakh. This was at the 54th Beal Master Open. It's a classical time control. Praggnanandhaa has white, and his opponent Visakh has black. Let's jump right in. E4, C5. The Sicilian is on the board, and Praggnanandhaa plays C3, the Alapin or Alapin Sicilian. And the idea is very simple. White just wants to play d4 and get a full pawn center. His opponent plays knight to f6, immediately attacking the currently undefended pawn on e4. The other main line from black is d5. The idea is after pawn takes, queen takes, black has a superior version of the Scandinavian because the knight at b1 cannot move to c3 and hit the queen because that square is occupied. But Grandmaster Visakh plays knight to f6, the pawn moves forward to e5, knight to d5, knight f3, and d6. What he wants to do is to dissolve Praggnanandhaa's center. Prague has space, so he wants to take that away. Pawn takes pawn, and he doesn't immediately recapture the pawn. Grandmaster Visakh instead plays e6. The idea is he wants to recapture that pawn with the bishop at f8. The only downside, of course, to e6 is that the bishop at c8 now is very limited in its scope. It's trapped behind the pawn chain. So Prague plays g3. He's almost like he's playing against this bishop at c8. The bishop's best diagonal now is to be on b7, play on the a8, h1 diagonal, but Prague says, I'm going to own that diagonal too. Bishop takes, bishop g2, knight c6, castles, castles. d4, expanding in the center, the original idea behind the move c3. Pawn takes, and here he doesn't take with the pawn and create an isolated queen's pawn position. His pieces really aren't ideally placed for that type of structure. He wants to keep his pawn structure healthy, so he retakes with a piece. Knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4. So now we see what kind of structure we have and what the basic plans are. We have mutual pawn majorities. White has a pawn majority on the queen side, 3 versus 2. Black has a pawn majority on the king side, 4 versus 3. So this position usually revolves around the advancing of the pawn majorities and the controlling of the one open d file. Those are the key imbalances in the position. Queen to c7, c4. Prague pushes the knight at d5 away, advances his pawn majority, and further opens up that long diagonal for his bishop at g2. Knight to b6, knight to c3. And this position has been reached 5 times. And it looks like white is just dropping a pawn at c4. But that's a very dangerous pawn to grab. And in the 5 games of my database where this position has been reached, black did not take the pawn. They played rook to d8, x-raying against the queen, and bishop c5 hitting the queen immediately. But in this game, Grandmaster Visakh takes up the challenge and grabs the pawn at c4 with the knight. Prague plays rook to d1, and this has a very serious threat. He's threatening knight to b5, which hits the queen and the bishop, which will be attacked 3 times and would win a piece. So Grandmaster Visakh has to do something about that. He retreats the bishop to e7, b3 to kick the knight away, and now bishop to f6 was played. Knight to b6 could have been played, but after bishop f4, queen c5, queen takes, bishop takes, even though white has exchanged the queens and is still down a pawn, look at the pieces. These bishops sweep the board. The pawn a2, a4, a5, a6 threatens to come, opening up that long diagonal. White is in very good shape in this endgame, even though he is a pawn down. His opponent instead plays bishop to f6, queen takes, knight, queen takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, knight, and rook to b1. So now we have an endgame. White's still a pawn down, but Prague's pieces are so well placed. Look at the rooks. One's on an open file, one a half open file, the bishop at g2. And how is black going to develop this bishop at c8? Very hard to do. Very hard to do. He plays a5, trying to liberate his queen side, but he does weaken the b5 square, and Prague immediately hops into that square. Bishop goes back to f6, now bishop to a3. The white pieces continue their greater activity. He hits the rook at f8, the rook moves to e8, and now c5, trying to pry open, again, pry open this long diagonal for that bishop at g2. We see this theme over and over again. His opponent then plays rook to d8. The best chance probably for Grandmaster Visakh here was the move bishop to e7, which puts some pressure on this c5 pawn. After bishop takes, rook a to c8, rook d to d7, and black can recover the pawn at c5. However, white has very strong rooks after bishop takes f7, rook to g5 to defend g7. This was probably black's best chance to survive, but Prague's rooks are just really, really strong here. But instead, he played the rook to d8. And after rook takes, bishop b7, the pawn at c5 is going to survive. He retakes on b7, but if Grandmaster Visakh had played rook to b8 to try to pin the bishop, after c6, Prague is in great shape. Bishop c7 and bishop to c5, aiming to go to a7 and trap the rook. Black would be in huge trouble. So he just goes ahead and takes the bishop immediately. Rook takes, rook to c8. Now, in this game variation, the actual variation of the game, the c5 pawn cannot be captured. It's protected. King to f1, king to e8, king to e2, king to e8, king to d3. So Prague is bringing his king up the board, and black has trouble because white's rook controls the 7th rank. The king cannot easily escape from the back rank. Bishop to c7 to block the rook, so maybe the king can get active on d7. King to c4, king to d7, king to b5. But we look at the two kings, and there's just no question white's king is completely dominant in this endgame. Rook to e8. If he tries to trade off rooks very quickly, rook to b8, then c6 check, takes. Now bishop to c5. After f5, say a4 to fix the a5 pawn in place as a weakness. g5, then bishop to b6, and the pawn would fall to e5, bishop takes a5. And white would grab the extra pawn and win. So instead, he plays the rook to e8, c6 check, king c8, bishop c5. What he wants to do is break this blockade on c7 with his own bishop by moving it to b6. Rook to d8. Now, this is a blunder in a lost position. Do you see the winning move for white? I'll give you a second. That's right. Rook takes c7 check. King c7, bishop to b6 check. And after king c8, bishop takes a5, king c7, and king b5. And white wins easily with the extra pawn. And in fact, Grandmaster Visakh resigned right after rook takes bishop. Of course, he saw all of this in his calculations. So this is a very effective way Praggnanandhaa is showing us to deal with the Sicilian defense. At the club level, the c3 Sicilian is quite effective because you regularly can build that full pawn center. I hope you've enjoyed the game today, and join us again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.